Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Margaret Walton Roberts. I'm from Wilfrid Laurier University and one of the researchers with the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities project. I live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I'm very happy to welcome you to our latest webinar and a series of webinars that we've been holding on international students. And this webinar will focus on the question, are international students disposable workers? Canada has invited over 600,000 international students into Canada at all levels of study by the end of 2021. And we've particularly seen the importance of international students for colleges and universities that in many cases have become, dependent on the revenue stream that international fees offers, especially considering the decline that we've seen in public funding to this sector. Research has also shown that international students struggle in terms of finances and take on any number of jobs, no matter how poorly paid, in order to survive. So we also have seen an ongoing shortage of public housing and also limited access to publicly provided services. And so we want to ask in this context, what are the impacts of allowing students to work more hours, and what will the rules help or hinder international students? And also, what does this impact have in terms of the economy? So we've gathered an impressive group of panelists to address this issue, and each panelist will address specific questions. But I will introduce all of the panelists briefly now. Our first panelist will be Arun Thangaraj, Associate Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. He was previously the Associate Deputy Minister of Transport Canada and has held a number of executive positions at Global Affairs Canada and CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. I'm then going to turn to our other panelists and ask specific questions, starting with Dr. Randall Martin, who's Executive Director of the BC Council for International Education. And this group advances BC's agenda on international education, and he has more than 30 years experience in post-secondary education development, including international education. Then Bipin Kumar is the International Students Representative at the Canadian Federation of Students. He also works as Government Relations Coordinator at the University of Regina Students' Union and as Programme Coordinator for the Canadian Science Policy Centre. Catherine Denler is a Research Associate with the Immigration Knowledge Area at the Conference Board of Canada, and she's worked as an immigration researcher, educator and service provider for over 15 years. Miriam Menkney is an Executive Director of the Catholic Centre for Immigrants, Ottawa, and previously she served as the Executive Director of the Multicultural Association of the Greater Moncton area and has held numerous positions advocating for human rights, women's rights and addressing homelessness. Mikhail Skudarud is an economics professor at the University of Waterloo, director of the Canadian Labour Economics Forum and a research fellow at the Institute of Labour Economics. His research interests include the labour market, integration of immigrants. And also Sutama Ghosh, who's a geography professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, and she's published widely in immigrant settlement and integration, including work on international student experiences. And Sutama will be making some concluding comments for us. Now, during the panel, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A, and we will attempt to answer them live during the panel, and we have some time at the end to also address them. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Arun and ask him to please briefly lay out the recent regulatory changes related to international students' hours of work and some of the thinking behind them. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you, and thank you for your invitation. And it's great to be with such a distinguished group of panelists, and with BMRC, who we've had a great working relationship with for I think almost 5 years now. Before I begin, I do want to also acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this place. As was noted, I'll give you a very, very brief overview of the regulatory changes and some of the driving factors behind it. And I think, one of the contextual factors is the fact that Canada has become top 4 destination for international students, and we are looking at over 700,000 students coming to Canada by the end of, that's what our data is saying for last year. Whereas, 10 or 20 years ago, we were at 1% of the entire market. And with that, I think there's a reflection of the study program, writ large. One element of it being the element of work. And there's complementary programs for postgraduate, but we were really focusing on what does it mean for a student who is studying and the hours worked as many students do. And as a program feature, there was a cap on participation or work hours at 20 hours per week. And there's a number of factors that led us to kind of look at the change, but some of the overarching strategic ones is the potential for international students to contribute more to the economy through participation of labor market during their studies, and to address, given their, to provide them with an opportunity as well to familiarize themselves with the Canadian market and with employers and also socially. And so as part of the transition from a student to a graduate to hopefully a permanent residence, expanding the educational or the work opportunities while pursuing education was seen to be an integral component to that. So in November, we announced the change that expanded or uncapped the hours that students are able to work off campus while pursuing their degree or their studies. And some of this was driven by labor market demands, and there's been a lot of calls as for students as an untapped labor source. But also, we are aware that international students, as they are studying, do face financial challenges. You mentioned housing, but overall cost increases for students, and this was also seen as a means for students to better support themselves while doing this. We did this mindful of the concerns, and we heard back from educational institutions, from students and others, is that balance that you strike between the hours worked and the ability to successfully complete studies, which is at the core of the study program. And so part of that is we wanted to ensure that students remain full-time. They cannot drop down to part-time or abandon their studies altogether. And and again, we know that there's unintended consequences and it's not perfect, but that was a feature that we built in. But the other issue that we were very cognizant of is students were often working more than 20 hours, but doing no sub rosa. And part of it, the intention of this is to bring those back where they were less vulnerable to unscrupulous employers, who are, maybe taking advantage of the economic vulnerability of these students. So, I think there's always, I think we weren't blind to some of the unintended consequences, but, the initial feedback is that it was positively received by students. But again, we are still in early days. And so part of, what we hope is, again, through the Q&A and through the comments of other panelists to get a little bit more robust feedback of the policy. But we are working with provinces and territories and educational institutions on the performance metrics that we ought to be using to address this public policy. One of the things I probably should have mentioned is that this is temporary in nature. This isn't a permanent change. This is only in place till next December. Now, let me stop there. And I don't want to take up too much time, but open to the rest.
Great. Thank you so much, Arun. That's really helpful. So with that, let's move on to our first question. The question is, how will the increase in work hours influence the number of people applying to be international students in Canada, and why? And so I'd like to pose that question to Randall and Bipin, please.
Okay, thank you. Good morning from the West Coast. Good afternoon to everybody else, I think. Thanks for inviting me to this, and I would join Arun in saying glad to be part of this distinguished panel. I'd like to begin with some praise for IRCC. I know it doesn't come all the time, but they've got a very difficult job. You've got stakeholders in the institutions who take personal umbrage at lack of visa success, and you've got lineups and an overwhelmed work crew. So, and you've also got what Arun mentioned of the unintended consequences. So, in answer to this question, will there be more applicants coming to Canada because of this this policy shift? I would say yes, but I would also say, are those the ones we want in terms of migrating, transitioning into the workforce at a later date? I can see large communities of stakeholders arguing for this policy in terms of, if I own a Dairy Queen or a Home Depot or a Best Buy, I'll be delighted to be able to have young unskilled labor come in and, in the service industry to work for 40 hours a week. There are populations, maybe smaller urban colleges, maybe some of the private colleges will really like this, but not all of the institutions do like it. And at the end of the day, is this fair to our students? I know this is a validation or a justification for some students who are maybe already working closer to 40 hours and keeping them in the fold and away from trouble. But if you're working 40 hours a week, is that going to extend your period of study? Is that going to allow you to give full attention to your studies? Is that doing a disservice to the students? And maybe one of the things to look at is some tough love in terms of making sure students can afford to come to Canada before we just give them opportunities to maybe disappear into the workforce before their degrees are completed. So I do think there are unintended consequences, but then maybe the bigger picture is that this is not about education at all, that this is about labor market development, and the labor market needs these people, and the unintended consequences, maybe some deleterious effect on the international students and the institutions. So yes, it will increase the number of international students. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Randall. And Bipin, would you like to respond with the perspective from the international students as a representative of the Canadian Federation of Students?
Hi, Margaret. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this wonderful panel. And I would just echo what Randall has said, that we do believe that this change in policy actually would help in increasing number of international students coming to Canada, because increasing work hours would actually help a lot of the students afford the high international fees that students pay. But as Randall has mentioned and Arun has also pointed out, the unintended consequences are students going to extend the time? That may be true, but that is because one of the things, as an international student coming from CFS, one of the things we actually hear from a lot of the students is the fees that international students pay is not regulated, and that increases sometimes 2 to 3 times compared to a domestic student. So when international students are paying such high fees, that's one of the reasons the students need more hours to work, is to just pay bills. And otherwise we have heard stories from students where this causes food insecurity or unable to pay basic bills and rent. So we do believe this policy change helps international students on that aspect. And it especially makes it more affordable for a lot of the international students. And I think this is one positive direction that most international students, we just had our AGM in November, and one of the big things, a lot of the students actually found this step very positive on that.
Can I just add one thing?
Mm-hmm.
We're very conscious that this could be a pull factor, and also, crowd in some people, unscrupulously, immigration. We're aware of that. So that's why you would have had to have applied for a student visa by October. So this isn't an open-ended, it's a time-limited policy with a time-limited cohort precisely. And I think, yes, I agree with both Randall and Bipin that this could be a pull factor and incentivize demand, but we wanted to draw a line around it so we could kind of assess the impacts and limit the cohort before we decided what to do. And that's why it's time limited.
Great, thank you. And so thinking about the potential for international students to increase the number of work hours, I'd like to ask Catherine and Miriam if they, do they think this is going to happen, students increasing their work hours, and what makes you think that will happen? So, Catherine.
Thanks, Margaret. And I just, like the other panelists, I would like to thank the BMRC for holding this really important discussion. Also, it's a pleasure to join the rest of you. It's always great to be on a panel like this, if for no other reason than to hear what everyone else has to say. So it's great to be here. Also, I notice my camera keeps freezing, so we'll just cross fingers that if I freeze, it's in a very lovely position. In terms of how many students will increase their work hours, I think it's really difficult to say. I don't think we have enough information to really know what's going to happen. What we do know is the share of international students who are working during study has grown significantly since 2000. There were policy changes in 2014 that made it easier for international students to get a work permit, and that does appear to have contributed to an increase in the number of international students who are working. So in 2018, which now of course is a little bit old, but in 2018, 5 out of 10 international students had T4 earnings. So we know a lot of students are working. But what we don't really know is how many hours they're working now. And there's kind of 2 reasons for this. One of them is the administrative data that we usually use to capture things about kind of earnings and income don't capture working hours. So the IMDb may allow us to observe something like an increase in annual income of international students, which could suggest that they're working more hours, but there could also be other factors that are contributing to changes in income that we see through the IMDb. The other reason it's a little bit hard to know how much students are working and how much we'll be able to measure the impact of the change is I think what other panelists have already alluded to, which is that there's a gap between what's captured in the tax records and what's actually happening. So, you know, as we've all talked about already, we know that some students have already been working more than 20 hours, with some or all of those hours being in the informal economy. And so the policy change could have a couple of different effects. It could affect how many students are working, those kind of 30 and 40 hours, but it could also change how many students are actually working those 30 or 40 hours in the formal economy and having that being reported for tax purposes. I think the best way we're going to know the impact of the changes in the short term is probably going to be through anecdotal evidence that we get through like international student associations, international student advocacy groups, international student offices at particular institutions are likely the ones to be hearing kind of the feedback about how international students are responding. If we want a more comprehensive understanding, then maybe one of the best ways to understand it could be through something like the Canadian Bureau of International Education, if they would choose to include questions about this policy change in their next international student survey. So in short, a satisfying answer, I think it's hard to guess. I think it's likely that students will increase their working hours, but how many students and how many hours? I think it's going to be hard to know, and it's going to be a space that we're all going to be watching for sure.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And Miriam.
I was on mute, sorry. Thanks for inviting me to this panel to speak on this. I think to some degree, it'll depend on what comes with this change. I saw in the press release that it's a temporary change. It's a pilot that is not intended to last, or maybe will be renewed depending on the outcomes, or like you said, the unintended consequences. How many will take up this offer, or how many will increase their work hours will depend on some factors, because international students who come to study here, I see them in 2 categories: those whose families can afford to pay their tuitions and send them enough to survive and pay the tuition and pay rent and all of that, and there are those who can't, and so they rely on work, and that's why they work part-time hours and change it to full-time during the holidays, like the law allowed it before the change. So where I see an increase possible is in the second category, that can't rely on their family to support them in paying their cost of living, basically. Because it's a temporary thing, if it might kind of allude to the international students that this is probably something to fix the shortage in labor market. We don't have workers. We're trying to get workers in all streams of immigration. But it would be encouraging for international students, no matter what their financial situation is, to take on more hours if this comes with, for example, smoother pathways to PR after they finish their international student, their post-secondary education. So it really depends on the details of what this entails. You take on more hours, you don't worry about having to find full-time employment, especially if you're working in your field as international student. And then what? Are you able to stay in that job? Will you get PR as soon as you graduate? That will help the students decide whether to increase their hours or not. And yeah, I think that's the category that we will see. It's hard to decide what the numbers are unless we have stats about, like, we know 600,000 in the country are international students right now. We don't know how many really rely on their jobs to pay for their costs. So that's what it will depend on. So it's hard to put a number on it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And so our next question we'd like to ask is, how will working more hours affect the academic success of international students and students' quality of life and their chances of becoming permanent residents in Canada? And so I'll direct that question to Michal and Catherine. Michal, thank you.
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to do this, Margaret. And thank you to the people who've already responded. Excellent answers. I couldn't agree more that, we can speculate about these effects. It's really hard to know without good quality data. And unfortunately, that's not there. As Catherine pointed out, the administrative data is just hopeless. We don't have work hours in the tax files. We don't have hourly wages in the tax files. We don't have occupations in the tax files. So where you'd want to get the data is from the labor force survey. I'm on an advisory committee at StatsCan on the labor force survey. I've been pushing them for months to start taking more seriously how we identify temporary residents, including international students in that data. There's a major data gap because of the way the sampling frame is designed in the labor force survey that we're quite simply missing them. That means that if you count up temporary resident the contribution of temporary residents to the Canadian labor force, we're probably at about 6% of total Canadian employment are now temporary residents. The vast majority of them are not captured in our labor force survey, which is like our main data. We measure things like labor shortages, which informs monetary policy. There's a big problem there. That I feel like it's getting bigger and it's being ignored. So what's the effect? Well, I mean, we could just speculate. Student success, what's the effect of this on student success? I have a project with IRCC that they're funding where we're linking student grades from an Ontario university, a very large Ontario university. That's one of the largest recruiters of international students. We're linking their grades, every graduating student from 2005 to 2022 with the IMDb, basically. So we have all their temporary resident permanents and all their permanent residency permits. We can see who is it that's staying, who's leaving. Is it the best students? Is it the worst students? In that data, ideally, we'd be able to see also what's happening in work hours and earnings, but we just don't have that yet. That's coming. In terms of PR status, well, I mean, we see what's happening. There's a lot of rhetoric from IRCC about skilled immigration. The reality is, in the past 2 years, we've very much moved towards we're shifting away from a skilled immigration program, economic class immigration program, to an unskilled. There's all kinds of changes on that front. So what it means, these kinds of changes we're seeing now combined with this shift towards unskilled immigration means that these pathways are increasing. It's becoming easier, which means the value of temporary resident permits, student visas, and work permits is increasing very much. The willingness to pay for these permits is increasing over time in a very significant way because those pathways are there. Migrants are realizing that they can get PR status more easily now than they used to be able to.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And Catherine.
Yeah, so I'm going to take the answer and focus really on the chances of success at becoming permanent residents. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different response than Michal, which is to say, I think that in terms of access to permanent residence, I think very few students are going to benefit from these particular policy changes. And so let me tell you a little bit about why. We all know we've seen big increases in international students enrolling in Canada, and particularly at the college level. And study at the college level doesn't really set people up for success in becoming eligible for permanent residence through economic immigration programs, since many of the programs do target people who have higher degrees and who work in high income occupations. Not exclusively, but many of the programs, that is the case. If we look at the kind of work international students are doing, there was a recent Statistics Canada paper which said that the top 2 sectors where international students are working are in accommodation and food service, as well as wholesale and retail trade. And few economic immigration programs are going to reward work in this sector. Of course, it's possible that some international students may be able to leverage this kind of increased hours in order to get a professional job, like a professional job that wouldn't have been available to them at kind of 20 hours or 15 hours a week. And then that sort of professional job could ease the pathway to permanent residence for those people. But I think few students are going to have that particular experience that I'm describing. So I see a couple of things. I see this disconnect between international students' work experience and the types of occupations that are typically rewarded in Canada's immigration system. But I also see a problem of numbers and a problem that's only appears to be getting worse. And there's simply not enough opportunities to immigrate compared to the number of international students who want to become permanent residents. So we know that in recent years, Canada has increased its planned immigration levels, but the growth in the international student population is outpacing the growth in the Levels Plan. And of course, the Levels Plan isn't simply designed to transition international students to permanent residence. It's designed to meet this whole robust kind of immigration imperatives. But we also know that recent surveys show that a very high percentage of international students are hoping to seek permanent residence when they come here. And so that's what creates this kind of numbers problem. So I want to illustrate this a little bit. If we look at 2019, at the end of 2019, there were 640,000 international students in Canada, and there were 180,000 work permit holders who had previous study experience in Canada. So that's a total of 820,000 people who have study experience in Canada at the end of 2019. Over the course of that same year, 2019, 59,000 people with previous study experience transitioned to permanent residence. So if we look at that group of people, it would take until 2030 for 80% of that cohort, those people who were present in 2019, to get permanent residence if the transition rate stayed the same. Of course, we know there was the subsequent temporary TR to PR pathway, which did allow kind of a group of international students to make that transition, but that's a temporary program and it doesn't address this long-term disparity in numbers in terms of how many international students are here, how many international students want to get permanent residence, and what are the actual opportunities to do so. So, kind of to bring it back to the change in working hours, it does help address this issue of parity and like work parity with domestic students who aren't facing kind of similar restrictions. But the changes don't address some of the core issues in the international student program and some of those core things that are causing the vulnerabilities that we've been seeing called out in the media with in particular intensity in the last year or so. So, oversight of international student recruitment, false expectations about immigration opportunities, and just the lack of transparent pathways to permanent residence for most international students.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. And so following up on that, then, how will these regulatory changes affect the Canadian labour market? And who do you think benefits from these changes? And could you let us know why you think that? And so I'll pose that question to Randall and Mikhail. Thank you. Randall.
Great. Thank you very much. I read recently that in 2021, I think close to 40% of our all new permanent residents in Canada had previous study permits in Canada in the country. Now, in terms of who, and again, the caveat that Arun has mentioned that this is a temporary program, absolutely, but it's going to be fairly hard to put that genie back in the bottle, I would imagine. So let's just assume that downstream this may continue for an extended pilot or in some other form. And upfront, who is benefiting? Well, I think Catherine sort of references is the aggregators, the apply boards, and the other major recruitment bodies. The agents, the individual agents, who is defining what our communities look like or our labor market looks like in 10 years? It's the junior recruiters in our colleges and regional colleges and polytechnics whose mandate is not about addressing issues in better labor market alignment, it's bums on seats. And if we need to create 40 more sections of business, let's do that, because that's where the market is. And so, you know, you've got a number of beneficiaries, I think, along the journey here. But I do think, as Mikhail mentioned, you know, this sort of trending towards unskilled labor and absolute lack of alignment, I think, with other labor market needs in key sectors, again, you know, early childhood education, health, construction, a number of things, and in key regions. And how do we better align a number of those needs through some of this tweaking to our immigration policies?
Thank you, Randall. Mikhail.
Yeah, Randall took the words out of my mouth. Who benefits? For sure. I mean, I really would not, I'd encourage Catherine not to underestimate how much of a shift there has been in the last couple of years, providing pathways for lower skilled migrants. The reality is that lower skilled temporary foreign workers have higher rates of PR transitions than lower skilled have higher rates than higher skilled temporary foreign workers. That's a study that was done by Fen Hao and Garnet Pico recently. So, you know, there are many pathways for lower skilled immigrants. And as we go towards this new Express Entry 2.0 system, which is not going to use the CRS anymore, that is going to change fundamentally. And immigrants know that because they speak to consultants and lawyers who are part of the beneficiaries of these changes of the immigration industry. Who really benefits? The way economists think about this is pretty simple. PR status has huge economic value around the world. If you want to think about, just as a thought experiment, how high that PR status value is, think about Canada changing its immigration system and just having auctions, literally auctioning off PR slots, permits, right? What is the willingness to pay? What kinds of prices would be paid? Huge prices. We don't do that for very good reasons. We've never done that. We had maybe an investor program that looked a bit like that, but we generally don't do that for good reasons, ethical reasons. So, but as we move towards a two-step migration progress, you know, the question is who gains that willingness to pay? That's what's called consumer surplus in economic theory. And ideally, migrants retain that. They don't pay it. But that's not what ends up happening when you move towards two-step migration, because what happens is that post-secondary institutions and employers are able to capture some of that consumer value, that surplus. How do they do that? One, tuition fees. So we see tuition. I teach Econ 101. This term I had 600 students in my class. 20% of them were international students. I don't know who they are on my roster, but I know roughly 20% are international students. The domestic students are paying $9,000 per year in tuition. The international students are paying $48,000 per year. I teach them exactly the same material. They're getting exactly the same product. Why are they willing to pay so much more? PR status. If you talk to them, they come to my office, that's what they're paying for. So what that means is increasingly, they're not here for education. They're not paying for education. They're paying for PR status. Universities and colleges are going to keep, because they're completely unregulated fees, are continuing every year to increase those fees, and they will continue to until they see some demand elasticity response there. That international students say, well, we can't afford this anymore. But that's not happening. I mean, then the applications keep coming. They keep increasing the fees, and the applications keep coming. So they just keep increasing the fees. Who else benefits? Well, on the employer side, you know, they're not paying to work. What they do, though, is accept really shitty working conditions. They accept really lousy wages and working conditions because that is the temporary need. I need this work experience to get me on that PR pathway. And I'm willing to put up with anything temporarily because that PR is worth so much to me. And that's how this plays out. This is how employers are able to capture that surplus value. And so there's no question employers, I mean, you want to know who benefits from this, look at who's shouting the loudest for the changes. It's corporate Canada. It's the Century Initiative. It's the Conference Board of Canada. This is who benefits from these changes. There's just absolutely no question about that. And I think then we have to really think about what we're doing. We have to think much more carefully about what is the objective of immigration here. And I think we've completely lost sight of that with many of these changes.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mikhail. And so to our last question, what is needed to make this policy change positive for international students and to enable them to enhance their contribution to Canada? And that question is directed to Miriam and Bipin. Miriam.
So I think we need to remember that we are part of a global community. And in the past, maybe a decade or two ago, or maybe not that long ago, we were seen as the innovators in anything immigration, but that's no longer the case. We are competing actually right now. I mean, if you look at Spain, for example, they have this new program that they call the Digital Nomad, where they allow non-European Union residents to live and work there for 5 years. Finland, who is not known as an immigration hotbed, and they are committed to tripling the number of education-based immigration in 7 years, so by 2030 approximately, and it's the same in a lot of Scandinavian countries. So we're competing right now for all types of immigrant profiles, including international students. And so if we want this to be successful, and I know it's a pilot program, but like as we know, most pilot programs become permanent after being renewed once or twice. So I see it as a long-term, probably permanent change, because it's quite the progress from the time when international students could not work at all. Now they were able to work for 20 hours a week or full-time during holidays. Now they're able to work full-time, and we know the benefits economically to Canada that will bring. So I don't think it's going to stay as pilot. So what's needed for this to be successful is, does it come really with easier pathways to PR? Does it come with a change of eligibility to serve international students in the settlement sector? Right now, if you know anything about the funding guidelines of IRCC, you can't serve anyone who is not already a permanent resident. If we're saying international students now, they can work full-time, what we need to think about is that we're going to see a lot of international students come as families now with their spouses and probably children. And that is a settlement process. They're not going to come as PRs. They're going to come as partners to someone who has a work permit. They're not eligible currently for settlement services, but they sorely need it. So are we changing that? They need to be helped to settle, to establish themselves. That will also increase our retention rates, because I worked in New Brunswick for 10 years in the same sector, and I have seen in Université de Moncton, which is primarily Francophone, a lot of international students, once they get their degrees, they move away from the province because they can't work there because it's a French university and they can't work with French alone. What are we doing to help international students stay where we want them? We bring immigrants to Canada. We require that they would have higher education, master degrees, bachelors, PhDs, etc. You know as much as I know that once they set foot in the country, those degrees most likely are worth nothing. They can't work with those degrees unless they get them recognized. Even if they do get them recognized, the professional associations will not let them work with them because they're internationally trained. This population of immigration, the international students, are being trained here. They get credentials here. So it's much easier to integrate them in the labor market. So what are we doing to keep them? Are we making it easy for them to stay, or are we going to let them stay on their own, go figure things out? We just want you to contribute to our taxes, but figure out how you establish yourself in the country on your own. So what is needed from my perspective is the same attention we give to permanent residents. If IRCC or the federal government is aware that this population is really needed economically, socially, culturally, you name it, then there has to be some give to the take. So that's how I see it.
Wonderful, thank you. And Bipin, please go ahead.
I echo a lot of what Miriam said, but one of the things I think I am just hoping that this temporary change does become permanent, as it has been mentioned by other expert panelists as well, in the long term. But I think one thing a lot of international students we do like to see is a direct pathway to permanent residency after graduation, instead of going through multiple temporary pathways or postgraduate work permits. I know a lot of some, especially during the pandemic, because of backlog, many students had difficulties getting access to the pathways. We would like to see that change as a direct pathway for permanent residency. And one other thing, which I think I'm not sure how this one, as we are allowed to work 40 hours, I do think that a lot of more students are going to work in a more professional jobs in that sector. But one big issue, at least currently with international students, is a lot of the work you do for while you're a student is not counted towards your permanent residency. So that puts, even let's say you are doing a lot of, imagine masters or a PhD student who is working on research in a university for 3 or 5 years, and when they graduate, or even for an undergrad student after 3 or 5 years, when they graduate, their work experience, whether inside the university or outside, is not considered towards their permanent residency. We would like to see that change, because consider at least with the, I'm not sure what the new express entry system is going to be, but at least with the current system where they do recognize the different grade scale, NOC 0, A, B, these kind of jobs at least being considered, even if you're working in these jobs as a student, these being considered towards permanent residency. I think that would help some of the smoothen the pathways to permanent residency. And as Miriam mentioned, yes, I think the settlement programs a lot of the times currently do not have a lot of the supports or anything available for a lot of the international students who would like to transition to a permanent residency. Seeing something of that sort would address some of the issues international students face while they're in the transition time between their graduation and getting their permanent residency. Right now, from some of the students I hear, it's like around 2.5 to 3 years where there's a huge weight gap because of either with the good backlog or whatever the difficulties. And I think as Mikhail mentioned, there's a huge gap in between the number of students coming to Canada with the number of permanent residents being given. I think just last year, the number of new permanent residencies, I think the quota for that has reduced by half to clear the backlog and cover that up. But that actually puts a big problem, is this is only pushing the problem of numbers down down the road, rather than resolving the inherent primary issue with it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you to all of our panelists for being so awesome and keeping to time. I'm now going to take a few minutes to address some of the questions our audience has been putting into the Q&A. And thank you so much for those questions. Some questions for Arun. Arsen Mahmoud asks, thank you for the update. With the rising cost of living and inflation, is there consideration to raise the $10,000 Canadian limit that has to be considered for the application of the initial study permit?
So there's a number of factors that we're reviewing. I think, listening to the discussion, there's two things that are going on. One is an overall kind of review, as the Prime Minister announced, of immigration writ large, but also of our student process. And so as with, we're looking at processing times, we're looking at, how the pathways are streamlined, program, like a variety of factors. And so again, we know that, as Mikhail said, the cost is an issue, and how we look at the financial ability, and in conjunction with this element is one of the things that we do have to revisit. So I think that's part of that review, and so where we land on that is yet to be determined.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to pose this question to Mikhail, a question from Ritu, who says international students often work for unscrupulous employers who take advantage of their vulnerability by having them work in unsafe environments, paying them unfair wages, or holding wages altogether, wage theft. What regulatory changes do you think should be contemplated to deal with this issue? And Arun, jump in if you know if there are any, but I thought I'd ask Mikhail that question.
there are minimum standards laws that are out there. They're very hard to enforce. And that's nothing new. That's true in the domestic population as much as the temporary resident population. As Catherine says, I mean, we don't even know how many students were already working more than 20 hours a week. There's just not a lot of information in this population. It's just really hard to know. What we do know is I follow nominal wage growth pretty closely. I've been following it throughout the pandemic because of these inflationary pressures for economists. What's happening to wages is really interesting. So I've been looking at what's happening to wages across the distribution. And I've been comparing it to the United States, which has had a very different experience with immigration through the pandemic. And one of the key differences that nobody's talking about is that nominal wage growth at the bottom end of the wage distribution has been much higher in the US than in Canada. By far, nominal wage growth has been largest at the bottom end among people working in retail and restaurants. This is where the big wage gains have been in the United States. That is not true in Canada. Not true at all. And I find it very hard to believe that that isn't in part due to the contribution of lower skilled temporary residents, not just temporary foreign workers, de facto temporary foreign workers, but international students. These are huge numbers contributing labor supply to unskilled labor market in Canada. That's dampening down wages and keeping wage growth from happening at the bottom end, which, this was an opportunity for lower wage workers in this country to make big gains, and it hasn't happened.
Great, thank you for that. I have a question here from Nelson Graham, which I'll direct to Randall, which is, given this policy change will increase international student numbers, are host communities and their higher education institutions prepared to adequately support even more international students?
So you're just rolling the dice here to see if we got answers, are you? Well, I don't think so, frankly. I mean, I'm not a pessimist, but I think I'm a realist. I don't see either, I'm sorry, Arun, I don't see either the federal government or even the provincial government stepping up in the community level, in the service. The institutions will do what they can do or what they want to do or can afford to do to varying degrees, but so many of the stories we're hearing are about the community groups, the mosaics and the successes, and the NGOs who are having to step up to offer transition services and support services for this big population of transitioning international students and temporary foreign workers. I mean, it would be great if, once they reach a health accord, if the provinces and the feds could talk about maybe this population a bit and what support services could be given.
So again, as part of a review writ large, we are looking at settlement, right? And the cohorts to which that apply. And again, it's too soon to know where that'll land. But it's interesting. A lot of the discussions we have with universities are, the pressure is very much, can you do this faster? Like, can you do this faster? And I think part of the discussion, and I kind of had Mikhail, when you said the number or the amount that international students pay, I kind of either had an aneurysm or intentionally blacked out as an accountant. But I think part of, we understand the desire of post-secondary institutions to do this, and we want to make sure that it's only the most trustworthy, students are funneled into the most trustworthy institutions that can support them. And I think there is an obligation, especially at those fees, for those institutions to take on some of that responsibility, because otherwise it's Pippin's group, it's Mosaic, it's others who take on that. But I think that as we all have a vested interest in the success of students. I think this policy is a small component, but a lot of it rests on the academic institutions themselves.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm just wondering if Miriam or Bipin or Catherine would like to respond to any of the questions very briefly before we hand over to our closing discussion. Miriam, anything you'd like to say in response to some of the questions posed?
Sorry, I didn't look at the questions.
Oh, okay, so fine. There's one of the respondents wanted to add to your categories of international students, and they wanted to say internationally skilled people going back to university. who have already come as PR, and then they have their children. I would imagine once you have people who are already PR, they're able to access the services that they need.
They do access the services, yeah. That they wouldn't have an issue being provided with settlement services, definitely. The categories I kind of put the international students in were mostly financial categories. Do they need a job or do they not need a job in current economic landscape? That's what the categories meant. But yes, there are many people who would choose after being PR to go back to school to just increase their chances of accessing better career pathways, and they're PRs already, so they would have the right to access settlement services. Yeah,
great, thank you. And then Catherine, thank you very much for putting the link into the study that you did with Stats Canada. I don't know if you want to mention anything else in response to questions that have been posed.
Yeah, maybe just to respond to the kind of conversation in general, I think what's really apparent in the conversation we're having right now is that there's a lot of stakeholders involved in this program, from the, policymakers to the educational institutions, to the recruiters, to the international students, of course, and their families, as well as settlement service providers, employers. So there's a lot of stakeholders at play. And I think what we see is like the current system and the current issues with the system, which are unfortunately resulting in some kind of predatory practices in some cases, come from kind of a lack of coordination. Are we bringing students who are set up to succeed academically, and are we bringing them into programs that are setting them up to succeed in the workplace, whether that workplace is in Canada or in another country of their choice? And do they have the information they need? If they're going to invest that money in tuition in Canada, do they have the information they need about the permanent residence opportunities they're going to have? And are institutions under pressure to support their students? And if they are bringing more students than they can support, are they going to lose access to that kind of international student recruitment pool? At the moment, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and there's a lot of coordination needing, but I don't see that coordination happening. And so that's where I'd really like to see it go.
And Bipin, maybe could you just respond to that as well from your perspective in terms of how educational institutions are stepping up or not?
Yeah, no, I do think there are a lot of discussions happening, but there's not a coordinated effort in one of those things. One thing, especially in the last couple of years, during the pandemic, we have seen a huge housing crisis in many university towns because there is lack of affordable options. And just in my town where I live, for example, just before in 2020, when the first year of pandemic, a university student can get an apartment or a room for around $500. The same thing right now, you are not able to get that for around $800 or $900. That's a huge increase in living expenses for a lot of the international students, which actually forces many international students to share their accommodation or go into very poor living conditions. They are not able to get any kinds of, I've known a lot of international students who actually don't sign any of the leases because they just share, and the landlords, they are kind of this one. So it's kind of where the post-secondary institutions really need to take into account whether there are the basic housing support or basic infrastructure for transportation to students to come to universities. Like in the AGM we just had in November, one of the students says because of unaffordability in housing, they're actually living like 30-40 minutes away from the city, and they don't have any transportation availability to come to universities. So lack of basic infrastructure in some of the cases is actually pushing a lot of the international students into difficulties after they're coming into Canada, and there are no institutional access to some sort of supports to any of these things. And I think the government regulating some of these things would actually be very helpful for a lot of the international students who are currently in Canada.
Great, thank you for that. And I'd just like to now hand us over to Sutama Ghosh, who will close us out with a few comments and reflections. Thank you very much. Sutama, over to you.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful to be in your presence. I will, make very brief comments and picking up on what Vipin said, actually. So I am a geographer, so I always think in terms of space. And one of the most important thing that came up, and I think the Deputy Prime Minister will, the Deputy Minister of Immigration will agree, is that the international students are not a monolithic group. And therefore, I strongly feel that the educational institutions who are actually getting them should be more regulated by perhaps by the feds or the provinces, more importantly, the provinces, in not only determining the extent to which this policy is going to affect, different international students of different cohorts, but also what is the need of those international students? Do all international students need to work these longer hours? And if so, what responsibility do these educational institutions have in terms of providing that kind of jobs that will actually accelerate their transitioning from being students into PR. What I'm trying to suggest here is that what role the educational institutions should play, not just universities, though, as the panelists have remarked again and again, it is also about the colleges and the private colleges, not just community colleges. The second point that I feel is that geographically, international students live in a variety of cities. And my recent study on Sudbury clearly talks about what Bipin was saying about infrastructure. And in these, in these cities, as it is, job opportunities are very low, and international students are often competing with the local population to get the jobs. So it doesn't matter if the hours are unlimited. The fact is that they will not get those jobs. And since they're competing with these people, as my study shows, that they face tremendous amount of discrimination, racialization, calling names, losing their jobs, etc. So I think the broader picture to me is that I am asking for more state regulation. I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. And I feel that perhaps we might want to come back to Arun to respond to some of these issues about regulation. And also, there are a couple questions still in the Q&A. One from David Sobel saying, what kind of evidence would people like to see to properly assess whether this is a one-time pilot or a permanent change to the program? Arun.
So let me I'll start with that. So it is a pilot, and it's responding to a specific set of circumstances that we were confronting, and a lot of the feedback from students and universities. Bipin, you talked about affordability, and again, I remember very struck by, I started here in September, and I think one of the very first stories that you kind of heard was, in Peterborough, Ontario of all places, students were struggling with paying rent, and the news was filled with articles of people who were coming and not having accommodation. That's really tough, and I think this is one component in addressing that. It is not the solution to all of it, but it is a way of addressing it. I'm very struck by the notion of there's I can't remember the number, 700,000 students who are here, and then how that tails down into permanent pathways. And I think that is something that we're reflecting on. If we look at both express entry and other, I think last year in 2021, 150,000 of those who became permanent residents had Canadian education or came on a study permit. And I think as we look at the various pathways, and we do know that, as many of you said, that this is a desire, it is seen of permanent residency is a driver of people wanting to come, and I think we acknowledge that. I think looking at what are the pathways and how we use the postgraduate work program as well as express entry, and Bipin, I know your comments around what we do count, but the PGWP is essentially designed to provide that experience, and how we do that becomes really important. And again, our thinking is, we're supposed to come up with our policy responses, our policy thinking in the next few months. So it will be a rather daunting challenge to do that. Maybe I'll stop there unless I missed something, but
there is one other question you might want to briefly respond to.
Sure.
Are there any plans to review the international student recruitment policies, especially recruitment through sub-agencies in
So this is,
sorting out
again, we're very, very aware of the vulnerability and the captivity of the students, especially if this is seen as the pathway to permanent residency, that you almost invite and you crowd in people, unregulated immigration consultants and that. And we've had dialogues with a lot of the countries, source countries for students, about, tightening up that, anecdotally, we know, our staff were visiting a country, and as they were going to a smaller village, a smaller city outside of the capital, you saw the signs as, apply to study in Canada, as permanent residents. Like, wow. And so a lot of the dialogue that we're having nationally with governments and that bilateral discussion is very much focused on how do we tighten that up and how do we get more oversight. I think also, as I talked about the review of the student program, the study program, is how do we look at compliance writ large in terms of the attraction and the funneling people into the system. But we're also very mindful of the eligible educational institutions, right? And this is a tricky one, given jurisdictions, and it's not the University of Waterloo's that we worry about here. It's those institutions that are specifically designed not for education, for other purposes. And so again, I think, as part of that overall comprehensive review, those are that oversight and monitoring are very key components, and how we not only design them, but how we execute them well is also important.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank you, Arun Thangaraj. Thank you so much. Randall Martin, Bipin Kumar, Catherine Denler, Mikhail Skuderud, and Miriam. Let me get to my notes. Sorry, and Sutama Ghosh. Miriam Mekni, Mikhail Skuderud, and Sutama Ghosh. Thank you so much for being part of this panel. I very much appreciate you being so succinct. Thank you very much to the audience for posing your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to respond to all of them, but please do feel free to follow up with the panelists and seek out specific answers that may have not been addressed. This webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on the BMRC website, so I encourage you to take a look at it. And again, I want to thank you all. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to the audience. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.